Ladies and gentlemen, as we begin our services here this morning, we would kindly ask if everyone would please turn off or silence all electronic devices. Thank you.
Good morning, shalom everyone. For those who don't know me or don't remember me from Diane's funeral 3 years ago, I'm Rabbi Gary Gans. I'm the Rabbi Emeritus of Congregation Beth Tikva. I'm sad to be here with you. I just saw Richard only 2 weeks ago. My wife and I went to lunch at our local restaurant and ran into him and Meira, also having lunch at the same place. Spoke to him for a few minutes, asked Richard if he still wanted to be on our prayer list, the Mishi Berach list. He said he did. So he was on our list until this week. He didn't explain anything that was happening in his medical life. Did tell us that he's preparing to go down to Florida shortly after we saw him. And I'll refer to that again in a few moments, but he did go and did enjoy himself. Just before we started this public ceremony, we stood together as immediate family, and I cut the ribbons worn by Rosalind and Walter. Rosalind was wearing it on her left-hand side, as is appropriate for a daughter, stepdaughter, whereas she referred to Richard as the bonus dad, and for Walter on the right-hand side. As I said to them, these ribbons represent the tearing that they feel emotionally. Torn, these ribbons, are never to be restitched. They can be discarded, but they are left in their current state of torn as they are within themselves. We also acknowledge his grandchildren of Ricky, Robbie, Tyler. We'll hear from Robbie in a few minutes. And Walter's daughter Sophie and extended family who are joined with us here today. As I said, we've been here before. We were here for Diane's funeral. And after the ceremony is completed, the interment will take place at the Ad Jeshurun Cemetery in Philadelphia, where they'll be laid side by side into eternity. I offer some prayers on Richard's behalf. Ma'ayan HaChayim, wellspring of life. We have come together, sharing our sorrow, to commemorate Richard's life. We recall the blessing of his life. We thank God for all that was good and true in his life, and for the precious memories which shall endure. Eternal God, his family, bowed in grief, seek light to dispel the dark gloom that threatens to overwhelm them. Be gracious to those who mourn, for they are in distress. Bless them with your compassion. Ease their burden of sorrow. Send them light and peace. For it is written, fear not, as I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. I will help you. I'll sustain you with my power. And let us say, Amen. Psalm 23. Mizmor LeDavid, Adonai ro'i lo echsar, benodesha yarbitzeni, al mei menuchot yanachaleni. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. God has me lie down in green pastures and leads me beside the still waters. God guides me on paths of righteousness and revives my soul for the sake of God's glory. Though I walk in the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no harm, for you are with me. Your staff and your rod do comfort me. You set the table in sight of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall abide in the house of the Lord forever. I share a text from Ben Sirach, written several thousand years ago, or my go-to prayers, favorite prayers at funerals. I've shared it with many of our congregants, my own family members as well. In translation, his words echo through the eons. We are all destined to die, he wrote. We share it with all who ever lived, with all who ever will be. Cry for the dead. Hide not your grief. Do not restrain your mourning, but remember that continuing sorrow is worse than death. When the dead are at rest, let their memory be a source of peace, and be consoled when the soul departs. Death is better than a life of pain, and eternal rest is better than lingering illness. As a drop of water in the sea, as a grain of sand on the shore, are our few days in eternity. The good things in life last for a short time, but a good name, a good reputation, endures forever. I've known Richard, Diane, for a long time as members of the congregation. But I really got to know Richard better on our adult Israel trip back in 2006. We enjoyed each other's company. We were a small, intimate group who experienced Israel, some for the first time and some as returnees, but a sense of, at that time, more peace and more tranquility. And Richard was hungry, intellectually hungry, clearly always an educator. He took this trip and saw it for its history, saw it for its values and sense of nationalism. He wasn't all that religious, although he did come with me to one of the Shabbat morning services, more as a cultural experience than to talk to God. But he saw all this as part of what it meant to be visiting in the land of Israel, and he got closer to that country, to me, and to the others who participated in this trip. And he always had great thoughts. He asked great questions because he was a man with an intellect. He appreciated his role in life. He deeply, deeply appreciated being an educator and must have been wonderful for his students because he reflects so much dedication and loyalty to them. I have a message from Dan Kramer, who was on that trip as well, who's in Florida. And he sent me an email, and I'll share it with you, or parts of it. It was a shock to hear about Richard's death. Deb and I just saw him on Wednesday, March 12th, as he was in St. Pete for the week. He and Diane always came down to St. Pete to enjoy the weather, museums, and restaurants. Since we have been here in the winter for 16 seasons, this is Dan speaking, we would always do something together when they were here. I got a call from him on Wednesday to gather, and we met at a park, and then went to dinner. He went on a dolphin cruise in the Gulf prior, and saw dolphins and enjoyed the mild sea breeze. They had good friends they often visited in St. Pete, Bob and Amy. I know we saw them earlier last week. Last year he came down to watch the St. Pete Grand Prix. That I didn't know about him. He seemed a changed man from those prior years. The last couple of years had taken a toll on him. I was amazed. He recently visited his brother on the West Coast and came down here by himself. This is Dan, and he were roommates on our Israel trip in 2006. Prior to the trip, he invited me to meet his wife. On the trip, he was an adventurer, traveling around when we had free time to other areas near where we stayed by public transportation. He also enjoyed lifting weights, and I was impressed by his strength. He was a good guy. Very sad, seeing his health go downhill after Diane was gone. Again, that's from Dan Kramer. We had good times, and we're experiencing sad times. And that's reflected in many ways by the book of Ecclesiastes. For everything there is a season, a time for every experience under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot what is planted, a time to tear down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to grieve and a time to dance, a time to throw stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to discard, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak. Indeed, it is a time to speak and to share, and I call first on Rich's brother Walter.
Thank you all for coming. I know how much Richard meant to everyone here, and he would really appreciate your company. I'll try to get through this. Bear with me. My big brother Richard was 4 years and 2 months older than me, and also much larger. He was only an inch taller, just over 6 feet, but significantly more meaty, more like our dad, while I was more slender like my mom. Richard was a smart, good-looking, and engaging youngster, a formidable teenager. He was not to be trifled with. On at least a couple occasions, I was spared a good thrashing by local bullies who knew better than to subject themselves to Richard's ire. Richard excelled in sports. He was a strong swimmer, and in the late 60s, he spent part of a season as a lifeguard in Oceanside, California, next door to Camp Pendleton. Several Marines owe thanks to Richard for being hauled out of the Pacific safely back to shore. He played football, baseball, and wrestled until his senior year in high school when he suffered a severe knee injury that prevented him from playing team sports. My at-home wrestling matches with Richard provided me a valuable lesson to avoid a sport where my head might end up locked in a sweaty armpit. To Richard's detriment, he skipped a grade, going from his last semester of 6th grade into his second semester of 7th. Already junior to many of his classmates, this made him 2 years younger than most of the other students. He graduated high school in 1963 at the age of 16 and was unprepared to leave for college. Instead, he spent a postgraduate year at a boarding school in New Jersey. I didn't keep up with him, with his schedule and travels until I went up to Boston for college in 1968. Richard had been there for a year, taking classes at Boston University and living in Cambridge. This became a difficult time for me as I witnessed the beginning of Richard's struggles with mental illness. For the rest of his 20s and early 30s, he battled his demons. Quite miraculously, he began to recover and went on to finish college and complete his Master's of Arts in Teaching. The miracle continued when he met and fell in love with a beautiful neighbor in his apartment complex. Diane shared his love of academics, a profound interest in Jewish identity, and a progressive mindset. It was truly a match made in heaven. When Diane began teaching at Rowan College, they purchased a lovely home here in Cherry Hill. Richard worked in Philadelphia at the Bridges Foundation, a charitable arm of the Marriott Corporation. He was in charge of finding learning disabled high school grads gainful employment. When he ended his career at Bridges, he became an adjunct professor of English at Camden Community College and taught literature and creative writing classes at Rowan and Rutgers. He and Diane loved to visit art communities, museums, galleries, gardens, attend movies and plays, and much more. They shared their passions with family and friends and developed warm and lasting relationships in their Havurah. One final miracle occurred when Roz, Diane's biological daughter, entered their lives. It was an instant love fest as they embraced Roz, John, and their kids, Ricky, Rob, and Tyler. Life can surprise us, and for all of Richard's trials and tribulations, he found his way to a life fulfilled with a satisfying career, the devoted Diane, and a heart full of love. He will be missed by me and many others. Thank you.
I now call on Robbie.
Good afternoon. First and foremost, I'd like to thank you all for coming. It would have meant the world to my grandfather. The support of people is kind of what always made him feel whole, in my opinion. He would always talk about the people he's met, the people he was going to meet, and the people that interacted in his life. As his brother said, they met my parents in March of 2016, and I was lucky enough to meet Richard on June 20th of 2016. He's been a steady member of my life, for the last almost 9 years. The way I would like to remember him, the way I think most people remember him, as a lighthearted guy. He was, although bigger in stature, which he would want me to mention, he was always one of the lighter guys in the room. He always just was really interested in what you had going on, what was going on in other people's lives, what was going to be served for dinner, what kind of dessert was going to be had. Those kind of things were really important to my grandfather. Me personally, he would always make the point to reach out to me. He took us in as his own grandchildren. I had a pretty close relationship with him, and looking back at it, Richard and Diane were a set of human beings on this earth that never had the opportunity to raise children, but yet somehow they fit in seamlessly as my grandfather and grandmother, and as my mom's bonus mom and bonus dad, or real mom and bonus dad. I have a lot of great memories of Richard. I shared one with his brother earlier. My parents obviously were very close with Richard and Diane. I'd love to share the story with you guys as a remembrance of him. And they went on a cruise in 2017 together to Europe, and it was the time of their lives. What Diane and Richard were to my mom and my dad specifically, they were to them. It was almost like an equalizing balance in life. And they went on this European trip, and they had the time of their lives, and that's all they talked to me about, which is really cool to hear about, but you'd also be kind of wish you were invited on the trip, And they had another trip planned in the summer of 2020. It was going to be Diane and Richard and my mom and dad. And, you know, you're always really fired up and excited for them. But again, the invitation never came. But unfortunately, due to the pandemic, they weren't able to go on that trip in 2020. And it got delayed, and it kept getting delayed. And in, obviously, the January of 2022, when Diane passed away, they never got to take that trip. Everything was booked. Everything was still paid for. And when it came time to finally go on that trip, Richard called me and asked me, he said, "Hey, Rob, you know, I think it would be really cool if you were with me on that trip instead of Diane." And I remember thinking, really cool is an interesting way to put it, Richard. But he extended that olive branch, and he allowed me to go on that trip with them. It was a trip that I'll never forget the rest of my life. It was a great memory with my parents. It was a great opportunity to be Richard's roommate for 10 days. And just a funny story of Richard. He was always, like I said, he was always a lighthearted guy. He just wanted to have a good time, eat good food, and have dessert. And we were on this trip, and we were in this beautiful room right out looking the ocean. And if you know Richard, you know technology wasn't his forefront. He was interested in it, but never really accomplished it. And we were in this room, and he looked at me, and he goes, "Rob, do you like the room cold?" I said, "Yeah, Richard, I like the room cold." He goes, "I think we'll keep it at 76. And I was like, okay. And he didn't know, but the room could be controlled digitally on your cell phone if you had a smartphone. And I had all the things set up on my phone, and he would turn it to 76, and I would turn it to 67. And he'd get up in the middle of the night, and he wouldn't be able to turn on the lights, and I would turn on the lights for him. And then he'd get back into the bed, and the lights would magically turn off. And after about 4 or 5 days, he looked at me and said, "Rob, the room we currently have, I believe it's haunted." I said, "You think that, Richard?" He goes, "The lights, they go on and off. I change the temperature all the time, and it moves. But it's okay. I think we're having a really good time together." I said, "Yeah, Richard, I think we are having a good time together." But that was Richard. You know, he was willing to go anywhere. He was willing to go any place, and he was there for a good time. He was a great grandfather. You know, I know he never asked to be, but he was, and he stepped up, and that's a testament to who he was. You know, him and Diane were a huge part of my life. They saw me sometimes at my worst times, and Richard got to see me at some of my best of times. I credit to them for making the last 8 years of my life better. I credit them for making the last 8 years of my mom's life better. You know, they filled a hole for my mom that was a giant hole for a long time, and it's one thing for someone to come into your life. It's another thing for someone to really make an imprint on your life. And I'm just grateful that we got to meet Diane and Richard. I'm grateful they accepted us. I'm grateful that they brought us to Kibitz Room Whitefish. There's just a lot to be grateful for. They're great people. And I just really appreciate you guys coming here. It would have meant the world to my grandfather. He meant the world to us. So thank you.
Thank you, Robbie. The family's asked me to take a moment now to see if anybody else would like to come up and share some thoughts and share some words. Is there anyone who's so moved to do so? Then let's take a moment to think about Richard. Think about Richard and Diane. And focus our moments, our memories, and our thoughts in that direction. We turn to a prayer that's called El Malei Rachamim, God the compassionate one. Even in terms of sorrow and sadness, we still turn to God for strength. I welcome those who are comfortable to please stand. El Malei Rachamim, Shochem B'Maromim, Hamtzei Menucha Nechona Tachat Kanfei HaShechuna, B'Ma'alot Kadoshim Toharim, K'Zohar Rakia Ma'asirim, Et Nishmato HaYashar Shalach L'Olamo, B'Gan Eden Tehei Menuchato, Ana Ba'al HaRachamim, Hasirehu B'Seter K'Napecha L'Olamim, Usror b'sror chayim et nishmato, Adonai hu nachalato, v'yanuach b'shalom al mishkavo v'namar. Amen. O God, exalted and full of compassion, Grant perfect peace in your sheltering presence among the holy and pure. The soul of Richard, who has gone to his eternal home. Master of mercy, we beseech you. Remember all the worthy and righteous deeds that he performed in the land of the living. May his soul be bound up in the bond of life. The Lord is his portion. May he rest in the tranquility of shalom, of peace. And let us say, Amen. You're welcome to be seated. Any memorial donations in Richard's honor will be welcome at the discretion of the donors. And following the interment in Philadelphia at the A.J. Cemetery, at Jeshurun Cemetery, the family and friends will be returning to the Sessions 52 for lunch. Zed